Thank you for joining us today for an event hosted by the Buddhist Marbles Society. I'm delighted that Graham Dixon has been able to join us at the Nanda Buddhist Vihara on various festival occasions over the last year. And so it is good to welcome him in another capacity this evening as our speaker. Graham has had an unusual journey from musicology to media strategy and now Buddhist studies. Having studies in Italy and Germany for PhD in musicology, Graham's career was spent in public media eventually as managing editor of BBC Radio 3 and head of radio at the European Broadcasting Union in Geneva. He first encountered mindfulness on management development program. This sparked his curiosity, and some years later, still working at the BBC, Graham completed a master's degree in Buddhist Studies. His book, Do Not Be Troubled, How the Buddha Faced Life's Challenges, was published by Mudpie Books in 2023. It recalls the fact that the Buddha was not immune from the same challenges the rest of us face. Graham is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society and a trustee of Chiddingstone Castle in Kent, which showcases an extensive collection of Buddhist artifacts. We are especially fortunate that we are joined today by Dr. Nick Swan of the University of South Wales, who will respond to Graham's presentation. His initial area expertise was the Tibetan Buddhism and culture, for which he was awarded a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Oxford. He's course director for the Masters in Buddhist Studies, a program made as accessible to students from around the world. He's also secretary of the UK Association of Buddhist Studies. For now, we are interested to hear what Graham has to say on spreading the Dhamma, assertiveness, or restraint. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Venerable Mahasangha and audiences both here in Chiswick and online, thank you for joining us. It's a privilege to speak in this historic place, so important for spreading the Dharma in the UK, and indeed standing here in front, perhaps you can see, of a painting of Anagarika Dharmapala. How appropriate. Studying these and discussing these foundational Buddhist texts before such a distinguished audience makes me feel rather more restrained than assertive, and I'll look forward to learning from you all during the discussion. During the presentation, so that you don't just have to look at me, I'm going to provide on the screen some illustrations from the Buddha's life, appropriate ones, from Gandharan friezes as we actually go. Well, we all know that the Buddha taught his unique insights, passing them to his followers. Had he not done so, then actually we wouldn't be here this afternoon. And it's widely known in Buddhist tradition that the tradition began as the Buddha shared his teachings with his 5 former companions, illustrated here. But today I would like to explore the whole idea of the Buddha and Sangha teaching the Dhamma. Since, strange though it may seem, the Buddha's sharing the Dhamma was not absolutely inevitable. And contrary to what some might have thought, it's my contention that Buddhism was not a tradition in which adherents actively sought followers. It's really that idea I want to explore together today, using the rich treasury, which we all know called the Pāli Canon. And let's set the context with a long quotation, no apologies for a long quotation, from the Samyutta Nikaya. While the Blessed One was alone in seclusion, a reflection arose in his mind thus: this Dhamma that I have discovered is deep, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, not within the sphere of reasoning, subtle, to be experienced by the wise. If I were to teach the Dhamma, and if others were not to understand me, that would be wearisome for me, that would be troublesome. Then Brahma Sahampati thought, alas, the world is lost, alas, the world is to perish, in that the mind of the Tathagata, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one, inclines to living at ease, not to teaching the Dhamma. Then Brahma Sahampati reappeared before the Blessed One and said, Venerable Sir, let the Blessed One teach the Dhamma, let the Fortunate One teach the Dhamma. Then the Blessed One, out of compassion, surveyed the world with the eye of a Buddha. And as he did so, the Blessed One saw beings with little dust in their eyes and with much dust in their eyes, easy to teach and difficult to teach. He answered Brahma Sahampati in verse, open to them are the doors to the deathless. Let those who have ears release faith. His insight that it would be wearisome was, of course, correct. There was, of course, surely a more peaceful way of living. And that's an area that I've dealt with in my recent book, Do Not Be Troubled, which really talks of the ups and downs, the vicissitudes of the Buddha's life. Disobedient monks, strained family relationships, assassination attempts, in addition to the daily grind of traipsing the dusty lanes of India for the daily meal. And of course, we know that not long after his awakening, the Buddha took to the road to find his 5 former companions, to tell them about the unique breakthrough in understanding. In some Theravada traditions, this narrative, the invitation to teach from the Samyutta Nikaya, is recalled every time that the community receives Dharma teaching. The lay people gathered formally ask the monastics for the teaching. We're not, to put it bluntly, even in the context of a vihara, having the teachings imposed upon us by assertive monastics demanding our attention. And this has various interesting implications. Primarily, the listeners indicate, and have to indicate, that they're keen to listen and attentive before the teacher actually begins. It's not widely discussed, but this raises questions about the attitude of the first followers of the Buddha. Putting it really bluntly, were they out to get converts? Or did they live the holy life for its own sake? And if people joined them, that was indeed a positive outcome, but not the primary purpose. Did the people request teachings, or did the monks approach potential candidates? The first sutta in the Digha Nikaya, discussed here a few months ago by Sarah, of course, urges a dispassionate approach, not to rejoice when praised, or to be downcast when disparaged. In short, was the dissemination of the Buddha's message across Asia a strategy or a byproduct of the dedication of followers, monastic and lay, who showed their neighbors a wholesome lifestyle through which suffering was diminished? The formal request for Dharma teaching, as used in Thai tradition, recalls Brahma Sahampati's appearance to the Buddha. The words do not actually address the bhikkhu directly, so it's not really a request, but rather it's crafted to prompt the bhikkhu by underlining the context in which instruction is sought and to recall the motivation of compassion. The Brahma Sahampati, Lord of the world, with hands palm to palm before his heart, requested a blessing. There are beings here with only a little dust in their eyes. Please teach the Dharma out of compassion for them. And we even find the Buddha's moment of indecision encapsulated in some Gandharan sculpted panels. And the fact that this continues to be recited, even where it's absolutely obvious that there are committed lay people present, strongly implies that the bhikkhu traditionally has not sought to impose teachings by calling the people to attention. Renunciants may be wanderers in their origins, but if you'll excuse me in using contemporary terminology, they were absolutely, in my view, not traveling salespeople. Writing from the perspective of Sri Lanka, a country which, as we know, has experienced missionary activity, Mahinda Digale points up the difference. An invitation from an audience is essential for a Buddhist preacher to deliver a sermon. This makes a clear contrast of the role of the Buddhist preacher and the way he or she functions in society. One cannot see Buddhists who go from house to house or from street to street to preach the Buddha's words. A similar study in Thailand likewise recognizes that the Buddhist monk performs his pastoral activities only by invitation, and that he does not go out to bring his lay flock into the fold, as does the Christian priest. And while you might imagine that an ordained monastic was open to receiving Dharma teaching, the Venerable Dhammasami, the former senior monk of the Oxford Vihara, told me, and I was surprised, that in the Shan tradition, even the monks make a formal request to the senior monk that the Dharma be shared out of compassion to diminish dukkha before ovada, or instruction advice, is given to the monks. Serenity and the unwillingness to cajole people may appear attractive, but it actually could prove frankly maddening, because in the very early days of the Buddha dispensation, it seems to have been taken to an extreme. In the Buddha's time, the first gatherings of the curious and expectant must have been very strange affairs, because even the receptive audiences remained unsatisfied and unacknowledged. Perhaps the monks were meditating, and the potential people who wanted to receive teaching were sitting, and the monks sat in silence. And as it says in the Vinaya Mahavagga, now at that time, monks sat down in silence. The people came to hear Dhamma. They looked down upon, criticized, and spread it about, saying, how can these recluses, sons of the Sakyans, having assembled together, sit in silence like dumb pigs? How ought not Dharma to be spoken when they are assembled together? This was reticence elevated really to an art form. And at this, King Bimbisara suggested to the Buddha that regular assemblies should be held, since other sects, having collected together on the 14th, 15th, and 8th days of the half month, speak Dharma. Probably still holding some doubts about the capacity for understanding, the level of dust in the hearer's eyes, the Buddha implemented this in two stages, first holding meetings and subsequently providing teaching. Things seem to have moved on, because when the new Sakyan assembly hall was constructed, the Buddha accepted an invitation to inaugurate the building, and in response he urged, instructed, roused and gladdened the Sakyans of Kapilavastu with talk on Dharma for much of the night. So clearly that was going to be a very long session. The modern day request formula, referencing Brahma Sahampati, represents a later ceremonial standardization post-dating the codification of the Pāli Canon. At earlier times, those interested in learning the Dharma simply expressed their curiosity with their own words and questions, though some stock householder expressions of interest survive from those wishing to balance the spiritual path with family life. This is quite a common one. Master Gautama, we have such wishes and desires and hopes as this. May we dwell in a house crowded with children. May we enjoy cassia and sandalwood. May we wear garlands, scents, and unguents. May we receive gold and silver. And with the breakup of the body after death, may we be reborn in a good destination, in a heavenly world. Let Master Gautama teach us the Dharma. There you've got a balance between householder life and wishing to learn the Dharma in that formula. But whatever the formula, some demonstration of readiness was expected. Though teaching requests were frequently verbal, posture was also significant. Those present generally sat to one side after making courteous greetings. The insolent Ambata, deliberately setting out to insult the Buddha, exceptionally remained standing. And in this case, the Buddha asks Ambata whether he would behave so poorly in the presence of Brahmins. Only a few lay teaching sessions in the Pāli Canon were actually initiated by the Buddha. Rather, both he and the Sangha responded to requests. Closer examination of the few occasions where the Buddha speaks first reveal unusual circumstances. In one Majjhima Nikaya Sutta, the Buddha inquired kindly about Pasenadi's downcast appearance. And in other Nikayas, the Buddha initiated dialogue through empathetic inquiry when witnessing Sigalaka's morning observances. Though he was not trying to stop these observances, he was rather trying to reframe them. And also he started a conversation first on seeing a bereaved father, and also another occasion when meeting Casey, a horse trainer who indicated his receptivity through his posture. The Buddha's famous request to the vicious murderer, Angulimala, stop, shown here, responds to the murderer's own stop, recluse, when he is trying to chase the Buddha, but cannot catch up. There's also the oblique remark to boys torturing fish in the Udana. Seeking to save the fish from further suffering, he asks, have you youths any fear of dukkha? Clearly the norm was some type of teaching request, or another indication of listener openness. Interestingly, the Vinaya does not urge the Sangha to teach, though it does praise those who have the ability, both monastics and lay, women and men. It only specifies who should not be taught. A person with an umbrella, with a staff, with a knife, with a weapon, wearing certain footwear, in a vehicle, lying down, clasping their knees, wearing headgear, sitting on a high seat, walking ahead, or walking on the path. And of course, the above restriction should be ignored when someone is ill. Compassion, rather than strict form, clearly wins the day. The conventional formula, recalling Brahma Sahampati's request, ties current day practice to the world described in the Nikayas. The Buddha's hesitation to teach, which occasioned the apparition of Brahma Sahampati, has been the subject of much scholarly discussion. I should add, most of it pretty inconclusive. For instance, one of the most recent people to write about it, Webster, admits that his own article in the subject is inconclusive. At least that's honest from the academic, and that the incident is frankly puzzling. And in the final act of desperation, he says, well, maybe the whole incident is a koan, potentially accessible only through letting go. It's an interesting scholarly analysis when suspending rational thought is seen as the only way to solve the problem. But the Buddha's apparent hesitation has perplexed many commentators. Why become awakened, achieve the perfection of compassion, and yet still hesitate? As early as the scripture we know as the Milinda Panya, questions were being raised about this curious incident, and the issue is confronted directly by Nagasena, who is asked whether the pause stemmed from fear, from weakness, or deficient awakening. Nagasena highlights that it was unthinkable that the eons of preparation, multiple rebirths as the Bodhisattva, had not resulted in sharing the Dhamma. It would have been a horrendous anticlimax. So was it hesitation? Was it reticence? Does the Buddha change his mind? Does his compassion arise only after awakening? All these questions have been asked. And that's absolutely not what the Jatakas imply, because if we read the Jatakas, we can see the development of compassion throughout. So it seems incredibly unlikely, because that would make the awakening experience somehow imperfect. The account of the Buddha's awakening presents an unfolding narrative, a progressive realization. Rather than immediately setting out to teach, the continued abiding after the awakening can be seen as a gradual dawning of the full implications of enlightenment. In any case, awakening does not necessarily impose the obligation to teach constantly. Think of Pacceka Buddhas, and also over more than 4 decades of wandering, the texts note that the Buddha lived at ease on occasion, for instance, when withdrawing from the Kosambi bhikkhus. It's a good model, perhaps, for any of us. Adopting some judgmental stance implicitly censures Pacceka Buddhas whose hearts are free from stain, despite their not imparting the complete path. The enlightenment moment is framed by realizations, so that the Buddha's hesitation can be framed as the gradual burgeoning of realization and compassion, a post-awakening analog to the accounts of the progressive awakening itself. If you remember the familiar text, when the mind was thus consecrated, I directed it, I discerned. So there's an ongoing process unfolding here. Concentrating too much, I think, on the Buddha's hesitation might over-reify or sort of fossilize a particular moment rather than seeing it as a dynamically developing state. The Buddha, when voicing openly his apparent hesitation, communicated his reflections on the difficulty of sharing something so subtle, the Dhamma. And Nagasena regards the hesitation in the Milinda as purposeful reflection. But the question remains, was the original request to teach, delivered by Brahma Sahampati, unnecessary? Because if that's the case, then the episode could seem like an imposing but rather irrelevant intervention. And at such a very important moment in the narrative, that would seem unlikely. Clearly, the Brahma Sahampati incident is regarded as an iconic moment, included in the canon to deepen the significance of what's happening. It underlines that the Buddha is the teacher not only of humans, but also of the gods. But I believe that there is still more to understand. Richard Gombrich has drawn attention to texts whose meaning has faded, mainly because the cultural references are now lost to us. And I would argue that the hesitation episode is actually an example of this category, but I think it's potentially recoverable if you can solve the mysterious puzzle. Shortly before the parinibbana of the Buddha, Ananda is rebuked for failing to request the Tathagata to live longer. This demonstrates, for whatever reason, I won't try and go into that some actions, even of the Buddha, depend for some reason on requests. And if we look at the hesitation episode against the background of the extreme formality of Brahminical instruction in ancient India, then it appears absolutely unexceptional. Waiting for a request for a teacher was frankly business as normal for any teacher in ancient India. Within the Brahminical tradition, the Upanayana initiation rite, the pupil in that rite was born anew through impregnation with the teacher's spirit. So initiation as a learner was not like turning up for your first piano lesson, forgive me. It was a really, really serious business. It was not to be taken lightly. One thing emerges with great clarity, namely that teaching is characteristically given in response to formal and extremely persistent requests. Anything less, and the teachings would be seen as undervalued and imparted too lightly. And it's interesting because there's some shared terminology between the existing Indic civilization and emergent Buddhist practice. For instance, Bahiya is referred to as a brahmacharin in the Udana, showing that the understanding of teacher was seeping through from the Indic originals into the Buddhist tradition. Indian teachers were known for their reluctance. Indeed, the Chandogya Upanishad recounts that Indra and Virochana were tested for 32 years, waiting patiently before the teacher, Prajapati, imparted knowledge to them. Seen from this perspective, Brahma Sahampati was observing traditional Indian etiquette, underlining both the teacher's status and the student's seriousness. Had the Buddha not hesitated, his embarking on teaching could have appeared less momentous, and the teachings themselves less significant. He needed to be asked before expounding the Dhamma, but who, from which realm, was of an appropriate status to make such a request? Who could approach the Buddha on behalf of the entire cosmos? The appearance of Brahma Sahampati representing the old order underlines the superiority of the Dhamma. The title Sahampati has been identified with the Indic deity titles Swayambhu and Prajapati, and whatever this neologism precisely signifies, and it's much debated in Buddhist vocabulary, it clearly embodies the loftiest qualities of Brahma, certainly including Lord of Creation. And therefore, in this narrative, we have the creator from the old Brahminic dispensation eclipsed by the Buddha's awakening, offering his creation as a willing student of the Dhamma. Brahma's own credentials to make such an astonishing request are impeccable because he is very much associated with the wisdom contained in, as the originator of the wisdom contained in the Upanishads. And he himself, in this case, is admitting that he has been surpassed. So the hesitation passage shows the Buddha recognizing the challenge of teaching compared to simply abiding. A reflection then interrupted by Brahma Sahampati's intervention. And only once the cosmos recognizes the Buddha's authority does he approach his first students, those with little dust in their eyes. The narrative confirms the Buddha's status as the newly enlightened Buddha receives endorsement from the former divine authority. I put this slide in a sense to indicate the notion of the alms round. In waiting for teaching requests, the Sangha was not only resisting the temptation to pester potential recruits and grasp at results, but it was also underlining the status and subtlety of the teachings. This tradition of waiting for an approach continued, and it's curious to encounter some writers who, making missionary parallels, think of the Sangha as setting out to convert and the alms round as promotional activity. You can actually read that type of thing. I would say that, like the rest of us, putting it really bluntly, the bhikkhus get hungry. And therefore I suggest, perhaps rather provocatively, that obtaining food is a good reason for the alms round. Bhikkhus have traditionally not even spoken during the alms round. So much for promotion. And as for its deeper significance, the Sangha being visible provides the opportunity for merit to be gained and generosity to be learned. And still at another level, the Sangha was making the potential for serenity visible. So the alms round was not an opportunity for lay, renunciant interaction and teaching. Indeed, the evidence is it took place in silence. Rather, it was an opportunity for people to witness Sangha comportment, an inspiration and blessing in itself. So when Tapusa and Balika, two merchants, approached the Buddha, not having yet been implored to teach, remained silent. But undeterred, they took refuge in the Buddha and Dhamma, showing that the Buddha's appearance itself could elicit commitment aside from any verbal doctrinal instruction. Vacchagotta later observed that the Buddha's appearance, remarking that his skin was pure and bright, as a jujube fruit in the autumn, an ornament of finest gold. And likewise, the Maha Sachaka Sutta marvels at how directly the Dhamma fostered freedom from anger, since, when Master Gautama is spoken to offensively, assailed by discourteous courses of speech, the color of his skin brightens and the color of his face clears. Likewise, for the Sangha, Sariputta, encountering the bhikkhu Assaji, found his comportment pleasing and noted his faculties were quite pure and his complexion very bright, very clear. Arguably, therefore, aside from verbal instruction, for some with little dust, witnessing this darshan, as I think we can call it, a display of serenity, was sufficient to prove transformative for them. It certainly proved powerful. On just seeing the Buddha, the lowly street sweeper described in the Theragatha paid homage and sought admission to the Sangha. As it says in the poetry, the merciful teacher, sympathetic to the whole world, said to me, "Come, bhikkhu." So for many, it may simply have been sufficient for the Buddha to make himself visible. For others, beholding the Buddha and the Sangha promoted inquiry. And even the Buddha had not taught, his actual presence and that of the Sangha would have induced transformation in some, as they silently imparted the path. The Buddha's decision about whether to impart formal instruction needs to be understood, therefore, within the context, the broader framework of the positive effect the Buddha and Sangha could achieve even when no words are exchanged. As I've said, the verbal teaching, clearly important, needed to be complemented by pleasing demeanor, and the detailed rules about monastic behavior in the Vinaya certainly support this. The whole community could have foundered on reputational damage. So far from being an obscure, puzzling, even embarrassing narrative, the hesitation episode underlines some vital points, important building blocks for the subsequent narrative. By sequentially outlining the insights before and after awakening, the Buddha reveals the nature of his experience and expounds the path. The hesitation allows him to state not only his compassionate motivation for teaching, but emphasized the extraordinary significance of his message as the great Brahma Sahampati is placed in the role of supplicant. And when this scene is reenacted in the request for teachings ritual, the Sangha ensures that instruction is neither given nor received lightly. And this all seems to make sense when we then read about where a vihara should be positioned. It should be close enough to the village. Here, of course, we're in Chiswick, but it should be close enough to the village for an alms round, but far enough away to ensure the tranquility necessary to support contemplation. What does this mean? Combined with the injunction against overnight food storage, it means the monastics are visible every day. Their serene composure will be witnessed regularly. Indeed, the monastic robes are often called the banner of the Arahants, the Arahanta Ketu. And as for the lay followers, or simply the curious, the vihara is easily accessible for those in need and for those who want to find out more. It's not so far from the village. The gift of teaching is given in return for the gift of necessities, dana. It's rather different from Western traditions, where the monastery was often built far from centres of population. And this brings us finally to a famous verse from the Vinaya, where 60 monks were instructed to leave the emergent community. Walk, monks, for the blessing of many folk, for the happiness of the many folk, out of compassion for the world, for the welfare, the blessing, the happiness of devas and men. Monks teach Dhamma, which is lovely at the beginning, lovely in the middle, lovely at the ending. Now, I'm sure many of you were thinking of that verse whilst I was talking. I've deliberately avoided mentioning it until now, as I think I might have provided a different context for it. Because against the background of a colonial missionary activity, this could be read as a Buddhist counterpart to a Christian obligation to go into the world and preach. However, coming to it afresh, perhaps we can start to see it that the monks are walking, being visible for the happiness of many, to provide them with a field of merit for lay generosity. Only then, and if people are receptive, can the teaching take place. What does this mean for us? Well, we're here in Chiswick, we're in a city such as London, and many of you with us from across the world are probably in the same situation. We're living in very close proximity to people from different cultures, faith traditions, or none. What is our attitude towards them? Are they potential converts to be won over? The downside of thinking like that, of course, is that every act of kindness, every smile, every communication we offer someone can become tainted. Is it freely given for the well-being of others, or do we have some ulterior motive? As with the alms round, being visible, that's fine and necessary, but I believe that a hard-nosed project to gain followers was never the intention. That poisons any transaction. Sometimes adherence to the Buddha's message was even more fluid when the general Siha became a lay follower, and he'd supported the Jains until now. The Buddha urged him to continue supporting the other renunciants who would otherwise be in difficulty. Indeed, the Buddha himself was praised for teaching the Dhamma without disparaging other beliefs. This brings us to Ashoka. Really a continuing tradition which finds echo of not disparaging, which finds echoes in the rock edicts of Ashoka about 150 years after the Buddha's parinibbana. I quote, "The faiths from about 250 BC, the faiths of others all deserve to be honored for one reason or another. By honoring them, one exalts one's own faith and at the same time performs a service to the faith of others. By acting otherwise, one injures one's own faith and therefore does disservice to that of others. For if a man praises his own faith and belittles another because of devotion to his own and because he wants to glorify it, he seriously injures his own faith." And Ashoka, of course, the emperor who unified India. But surely the attitude of the Buddha, speaking to those who requested the teachings, became a more formal policy under Ashoka, who provides a valuable model for societal harmony. Being open to recognizing what is wholesome in other traditions, that's not a bad principle. And in the light of this, we perhaps need to rethink our view of what have been called the Ashokan missions. Rather than simply attempts at conversion, which some scholars have proposed, were these not peaceful envoys accompanied by monastics sharing learning and expertise? And indeed, in the Mahavamsa, we have them resolving various problems, societal problems, and only then giving formal teaching, presumably in response to formal expressions of interest. Despite its prevailing restraint, the Sangha expounded and continues to expound a transformative Dhamma, capable of turning upright what has been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. Though the community was confident throughout, the community was confident about the effectiveness of these teachings, although was not proactively calling people to attention. It's also interesting that the transformative appropriation of Dhamma is seen as manifesting progressively, even over multiple lifetimes. So in counting the Buddha and the Sangha on the alms round offered the opportunity to develop the habit of altruistic giving, the beginning of the graduated path, eroding the sense of I, an I stationed at the center of the universe, and to begin to engender a wholesome ethical stance. For someone with sufficient clarity of vision, sufficient curiosity, countercultural enough to approach and inquire, they could access Dharma instruction. And in this way, the Buddhist community emerged as the beneficiaries of Brahma Sahampati's petition, as the doors to the deathless were opened through the teaching of the Dhamma. Thank you. Now, it's a great pleasure to continue in dialogue with Dr. Nick Swan, who I still remember my first interview with him as his MA student. Fortunately, he did accept me onto the course, which I'm eternally grateful, Nick. And really, it was a great life decision as we went through together the learning about the rich complexity of the Buddhist traditions, though I should say that I generally chose the Theravada essay options. Nick Howe is an expert. His PhD from Oxford is on Tibetan Buddhism. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay, apologies. I always thought it was. And he's recently become involved in our activity at Chiddingstone Castle, private museum in Kent, supporting our redisplay of items, the interpretation of items, with the intervention of the Tibetan community. So really very grateful for the fact we have this continuing dialogue. And of course, he's the course director of the MA in Buddhist Studies at the University of South Wales and the secretary of the UK Association of Buddhist Studies. Now, I fear he's going to ask me some questions.
So although it's not going to be an academic discussion as such, I'm going to, or a thesis defense as such, I am going to begin with the classic thesis defense opener, but it's a very soft one, which is really what caught you, why is this subject being important to you? What's caught your attention about this, and why did you want to kind of explore it in such depth?
Yeah. I think probably the idea really occurred to me because I think it was in the last paragraphs of what I said, something about the sort of stridency of people, you know, only I am right, this is what I believe, I might need to impose these beliefs on others. And I think that type of feeling, which I had great aversion to, and have consistently had great aversion to, as opposed to people being able to discuss with each other, to respect each other's opinions, and actually, you know, to share opinions and say what you believe, but at the same time, not to sort of try and coax and cajole. I think that was a very strong belief that I started to notice when I started to read the Pāli Canon as a way in which there was not only the academic side, of which you heard, but also at the end, I think there's a really interesting societal message, because actually the world of the Buddha was one that has had a very, very high degree of pluralism, different renunciants with different doctrines, many of them actually still recorded. And it could have been extremely, you know, aggressive and not very harmonious, but it seems that actually there was a feeling that they could actually debate with each other. Even if they didn't agree, they could at least debate and talk. So I think it was that societal feeling that made me think, actually, there's something here, made me notice it, and therefore go forward to choose it as a subject.
Thank you. So I think we'll probably return to the subject of society of the day, and some mentions of that, particularly with requesting teachings and so on at some point in our conversation. I was going to say that when I find the story of Brahma Sampati interesting. I find the story of the previous Buddhas interesting too, because there were some 7 mentioned in Pali sources out of 24 that are believed understood to precede the Buddha. As an academic, it can be easy to perhaps treat those stories simply as myths and simply to be analysed as myths. And it's inevitable that I might do something along those lines in the next few sentences, but it doesn't mean that I think it's the only way. I'm not sort of saying that kind of European ways of understanding Buddhist texts are somehow superior to the insider's approach to understanding those texts either, but they can shed light. They can sort of shed some sort of interesting sort of points on there. I think Buddhaghosa said that the Buddha waited for Brahma Sampati to request him because it was a convention, because there's the idea that in the previous Buddhas, they all go through the same, they have the same kind of milestones in their lives in terms of renunciation and practicing ascetic practices, but for different periods of time and so on. But one point would be that once they have achieved Nibbana, they then need to be requested. So Shakyamuni Buddha, Gautama, was waiting for that moment in order to fulfill that that moment in his life. Looking back at some of the briefly at some of the narratives of say Dipankara Buddha and Kassapa Buddha, I couldn't see a particular moment of them being requested. But this is only a very superficial request. But perhaps at some point the venerables in the audience may be able to help us to understand that. And in fact, the Brahma Sampati was supposed to have been become a monk under Kassapa Buddha, and then he sort of achieved a particular state that meant he was reborn in the Brahma realm. I'm sure I'm going to lead up to a question for you in a moment, Graham, but I'm sort of wandering around these kinds of different ideas. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts about the sort of the role of earlier Buddhas and symmetries that might be found in the way that, say, the Gautama Buddha story had to fit those kinds of structures. I don't know if you've got anything.
Yeah, I did think about this, but I suppose where those narratives do occur, and where it actually is showing that this is a tradition that stretches back for eons, for whatever reason, it's showing that the nature of things always remains the same. And I think that's probably, as I see that, underlining, rather like the moment of awakening where the Buddha touches the ground for the earth to bear witness. That is in a sense saying things are like this. There has always been suffering, but also there is also a way out of suffering, to take the very big picture view of this. So effectively, where those, let's say, symmetries occur, where you get those analogues between one life and another, I suppose I haven't been quite so interested in looking at, as it were, so much why it's repeated, but really thinking, if that occurs, why is it actually there, the request to teach?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. We were talking earlier about the kind of the way that the requests to teach has been codified, and you mentioned how monks are expected, even though they are turning up to classes, and say in the Tibetan context, it might be in a monastic university where they know they're going to be taught that day, and their teachers know they're going to be teaching, but nonetheless the monks go through a formula at the beginning of each teaching session to request the teacher to teach them. This tends to be done in a sort of a way where they might ask 3 times, or particularly with say tantric teachings, you would make the request 3 times. Often it might just be that somebody is asking you to kind of repeat what they say in Tibetan, and then you repeat it back, and then formally you've made that kind of request. I think that group of 3 requests means it's sort of, you definitely want it. You're not just doing it by accident. In the way that say when Ajatasattu approaches the Buddha to ask him about starting a war with the Vajika League, he asks. The Buddha replies twice. It's no. Basically, you should not start a war. The 3rd time, he just remains silent. There was no point repeating it again. but the formula of 3 is completed and it's resolved as a definitive answer. And when people go to refuge, they say the refuge vow 3 times typically to kind of confirm that they're not just doing it by accident. But this is something we mentioned that it doesn't seem to happen with when Brahma Sahambati asks the Buddha. I don't know if you've got anything to sort of respond to about that. I'm not asking again. I'm very happy with Webster definitive answers or anything like this. It is speculative, but I think it's worth it.
Yes, I mean, I was a little bit critical of Webster in saying he sort of withdrew from the whole thing, saying, "Oh, it's just a mystery," which is a bit of a pity in an academic article. I think the asking 3 times is something that comes out very strongly, and indeed, you know, in many chants, like going for refuge, you will actually be doing that, you know, 3 times under, you know, tatiyampi, you'll be absolutely underlining that this is seriousness. But actually, strangely, during the afternoon, Nick and I did look at the original text here, and Brahma Sahambati, unless there are various versions of the text in various parts of the canon, because we didn't do an exhaustive search, it appears that he only asked once, which just seems a little bit strange, whether it's a sort of iconic moment encapsulated like that. But it would have seemed somehow that 3 would be appropriate. On the other hand, it's such a dramatic moment itself. This meeting between the old order and the new order, maybe it in itself is so iconic that there's a particular moment. It's just like, you know, to return, just because I've just said it, it doesn't say that the Buddha touched the earth 3 times, for instance, to prove the seriousness of touching. Not everything happens 3 times. So maybe these really serious things are an absolute moment, which is sort of encapsulated rather than something that needs that 3-time repetition. But it'd be very interesting if anyone else has views on that, I know.
Actually, yes, leading on from that, maybe because the character of Brahma Sahambati was so key that he could just be trusted to know that his request was sincere the first time around. He wasn't just accidentally asking or something like that. Maybe there's something like that in it. It's speculation, but which is maybe a bit risky, but there could be something in that. There is also in, say, looking at religious texts more broadly, not just Buddhist texts, there is a kind of a measure of what might be authentic, what might be sort of historic, have some sort of historicity to it. There are different sort of ways you can approach this, but one feature of a text is if it's something a bit startling, if it perhaps doesn't show that religious character in a particularly good light by outside standards, then that can sometimes be thought of, well, this probably happened then, because there are kind of questions raised about it. One can think of the initiation of the Bhikkhuni Sangha, when the Buddha initially said no and didn't believe it would be a good thing, but eventually, after Ananda requests him, he changes his mind, and the Bhikkhuni Sangha is formulated with some caveats. This is kind of a bit like that. There's a sense of reticence in the foundation of the Bhikkhuni Sangha, and a sense of reticence in the initial sort of teaching. But I don't know if it could be thought of as being like, so this definitely happened because there's so much mythology around it. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I think just to say, to agree with what you said, that the unusual elements in the Pāli Canon is what makes me think that actually there is a lot of veracity and there's a lot of truth in it, because frankly, had I been redacting the Pāli Canon, there are some things that I would probably have taken out, because actually they could be unhelpful to someone just coming across those. So, and you mentioned one, for instance, the hesitation over the Bhikkhuni Sangha, which you could think, well, now it's agreed, let's write it up that there wasn't hesitation. It would be a far better, stronger story. But actually, it seems that those who were compiling those texts were really concerned. I think the one that I always think is interesting, and I've forgotten the person's name, who meets the Buddha, I think at a crossroads shortly after his awakening, and says, "What's your teaching?" And the Buddha explains, and the guy, I think it says, he furrows his forehead, he, sort of shakes his head and walks off on another road. If I were editing it, I'd have probably taken that out. And that's why I think we can be, really certain that what's actually there is a reasonable record. I think there must be different interpretations of hesitation. I've always seen the Bhikkhuni Sangha as the issue in ancient India of frankly the danger of a woman going out with a bowl on an alms round and living somehow independently. And actually it took a bit of processing to work out how that could be done, because it would seem to me to be ridiculous that the Buddha concedes that in response to the question unhesitatingly that women are actually on the same spiritual path. So he gives that, but he takes back with the same hand. So I think this is about, I've always thought that was about security and safety rather than anything. So maybe I think it's a different type of hesitation where you've got to think through the practicalities rather than anything else.
I think many would agree as well that it was a sense of that of the situation, the position of women in Indian society at the time, definitely. I mean, also thinking about when you going back to the two ideas about the having to request things 3 times and that being just the norm, requesting things from your teacher. It made me think of when you talked about Angulimala, because I sometimes reach back into my memory a little bit here, but Angulimala started off as a student, and it was his teacher who set him on a path to go and create a mala of 108 human fingers. But I don't know, going back into sort of mythology again, I'd maybe like to look again. I'm not expecting you to know this at all. I'm just thinking on my feet that I'd quite like to look back at that story and see about what requests were made of him, how that interaction took place to establish Angulimala on that path. Well, I'm running out of questions to ask. I've got one more comment to make, and while I don't want to make it too much of a kind of an interfaith kind of discussion or something like that, when you mentioned about the differences between sort of Buddhist viharas and Western monasteries, as you put it, I'd say one difference is economics. So bhikkhus and bhikkhunis aren't allowed to store food, as you say, so they have to go on daily alms rounds, so they've got to be quite close to people to do that. Whereas with, say, a Christian monastery following the rule of St. Benedict, they would have to work. They'd have to do some productive work on a regular basis. And so they'd be producing things to sell. So they could live a bit further away. They could be a bit more isolated from context. So I think different sort of social and economic kind of dimensions to that.
Just quickly to add that, interestingly enough, by the time you got to about I'm going to get the century wrong, 13th century, with orders like the Franciscans and the Dominicans, I think they noticed the defect of being so far from the people, and as the Benedictines were, and the Franciscans and the Dominicans actually came into towns, and I think that's the reason they're called friar. The distinction is if they're in towns, they're friars, and if they're in monasteries outside, they're monks. So it's quite interesting that probably that sense of being a long way from people eventually, didn't seem to be a vocation, let's say, for every Christian monastic.
Thank you so much, Graham. I'm afraid I've got to get a taxi in 5 minutes to go to the airport, so I'm going to have to wind up.
Very, very big thanks to you. Nick is probably the first person ever to actually drop in at the London Buddhist Vihara somewhere between Wales and Australia. And he's got a flight in just over 2 hours. Normally people leave from here for the evening Colombo flight, but you're going via Delhi, aren't you? So Nick, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you for joining us today. If there are any brief questions in the audience here at the Vihara, we'll be very happy to answer for them to be asked here. We've got some venerable monastics from various Buddhist traditions here today. And perhaps in terms of, if we could ask them to also engage in this subject of spreading of the Dhamma, in your various locations, I know we've got a monk originally from Bangladesh. We've got a monk who has, I think, lived in Sri Lanka, but was originally from Denmark. And we've got Venerable Nagase, who is the monk at the London Peace Pagoda in Battersea Park. And in your various ways, you are all spreading the Dhamma. And I'm just wondering if you all have any reflections on the subject of whether it should be a very restrained or assertive mode of communication, should we say? Well, for example, Graham, if I can ask you, I mean, in terms of this temple and the legacy of Anagarika Dhammapada, who actually came to London in the early 1920s, specifically to plant the seed of Buddhism in Britain. We believe it's the first Buddhist monastery outside Asia. So he clearly had a vision of wanting to spread Buddhism outside its traditional homeland, should we say. And he had by that time traveled through a number of countries, both in Asia and around the world, and seen under colonial times, really, the poor state of Buddhism in several of the countries that he was traditionally habitual to. But he still had wanted to make the effort to spread Buddhism here. And we, among Sri Lankans, consider him to be quite assertive, actually. Yes. Okay? And sometimes people call him a missionary. And would that be the correct way, or not a correct way, so perhaps correct is the wrong word, but is the emphasis when we're in countries outside its traditional homelands, outside the places where the Buddha originally was alive and propagated his message, how is the tone of the message to be differentiated, should we say?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I sometimes wonder whether the fact of colonialism at certain points meant that in order to use an English vocabulary which was understandable, certain words were adopted, like missionary or gospel I've seen as well. There was a book, The Gospel of the Buddha, which actually you're using that type of word because actually using the English language, the language of colonialism, if you like, was a shortcut towards understanding. But I think a more important thing, and, I could never really know this. I mean, clearly, no one is going to say that spreading the Dharma, no one's going to say here, the spreading the Dharma is a bad thing. But actually, I think it's a question of the attitude with which it is done. Is it that, making the Dharma visible, making it visible, as I was saying, through the arms round, making just being, and then people are attracted and come along. But it is unlikely. That you're not standing on a street corner handing out leaflets and things. So I think there's something about visibility and being happy and willing to share in a compassionate way to anyone who turns up. But actually, it's whether there's a sort of definite strategy in a way to that seems to me it's probably very, very finely tuned. And I would have to know Anagarika Dhammapala's writings probably better to see where he was. On the other hand, do remember that he, just like, for instance, and with an audience of many Sri Lankan people, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think it is in about the 1890s, I think for the first time, a Buddhist catechism was published as a sort of response with, is it Oscott? Olcott, in response to the communication techniques of, particularly of the Methodists, I think, who were using that type of communication, which until now hadn't been necessary. So in a sense, you could say, oh, that's got a bit more assertive because they published a catechism and handing out copies of it, whereas previously you would have learnt the Dhamma perhaps by osmosis within the family, attending, but actually became more formal. And probably that's in a way a response to, the communication methods, which were probably more powerful. I think I do remember, isn't there a fantastic story? I think Elizabeth Harris is probably with us, who's the president of the UK Association of Buddhist Studies. And if I hope I quote her correctly, but in one of her books, there's a moment where I think Methodist missionaries have arrived in Sri Lanka and they brought a printing press with them. And the Buddhist monks think, well, that's very nice. We'll go down to these new arrivals and ask to use the printing press, so we can we can use this new technology as well. And I don't think that was their intention. Actually, I think they wanted their printing press for themselves, not to be shared between the different religious communities. So there is something about trying to mirror the communication techniques of the other.
Thank you, Graham. And actually, a further reflection, really bringing the topic to the modern time, is the fact that we're living in very fast-moving environments, especially with technology. I'd like to ask from you, your personal background, it being in the media, formerly working at the BBC, indeed. If Anagarika was alive today, he'd be all over the place on the media, I would imagine, trying to spread Buddhism. And how should we, even for the British Mahabodhi Society, be using those kinds of channels, not in an assertive way necessarily, but in a sublime way, shall we say, be promoting Buddhism? Is that something you could talk about?
Yes, I think that there are great debates about any means of communication, whether they've been good or bad or whatever. But I think every means of communication, whether that's from Alexa to TikTok or whatever might be out there, it's neutral. It's actually the content that's put onto these platforms which actually defines what you're doing with them. And I think that different social media, all of that, I think, is very, very positive, because actually the good thing about that is you can put a message out there and actually, people are not obliged to follow it. You're not shouting in their face. But if they see something and there's some interest and that interest is sparked, then they can follow. So actually, I think it's a really rather nice way, because in a way, you could say it's assertive putting something out at all. But then you could say that the Buddha and the Sangha made themselves visible on the alms round. So they are putting, in a certain sense, there's visibility, but there's no, you're not forced to follow a certain thing. So it's probably an environment that goes really quite well with the communication of Buddhism, because you're not feeling more so than actually, approaching someone. I think there's a comment about early missionaries in Thailand. I think it's Thailand, where where people said, but what are these guys doing? I don't want to talk about religion. I'm going off to the market to buy vegetables. So I think with social media, you're not in that position, but but something is there that people can consume and can more deeply enter into as they wish, because the onus is on them to follow and to click and to go through.
And of course, that makes one think also about the times we lead in and how other religious communities are promoting themselves. And I just want to, for example, we have evangelical Christians promoting Christianity in a very robust way, shall we say, sometimes even Islam. But we as Buddhists, for many of the reasons you've said, have tended not to be so assertive, should we say. And if you look at Britain now, we have almost all the main Buddhist traditions in the UK, right? So that you don't have to go to Asia now to experience them. They're actually on the doorstep of pretty much most British people. So there is some degree of penetration, shall we say, of Buddhism in the UK, but I still feel that with only, I think in the last census, it says there are roughly 200,000 Buddhists in the UK. That may be probably maybe light on that. Is there a sense that we Buddhists need to be more out there, shall we say?
Heavens, that's a really, really difficult question. I mean, what I really think, and that's what Ashoka says as well, which is I think why I quoted him, is that it's really important to be able to talk about your own tradition in a positive way, but not denigrate others. And that's where I do have difficulties with certain groups where they're saying, you know, this is the only way, this is in a very, very assertive way, and actually not seeing that there could be any inherent good or wholesomeness in any other tradition. I think that's a very difficult thing. But of course, at the same time, as you sort of imply, it a little bit puts Buddhism on the back foot, because actually there isn't that, and that's probably a matter for, you know, also reflection within the community, I suppose, about, you know, education and about actually how it's communicated, how, you know, events, I wouldn't say it just because I've spoken, but events such as this are really important, I think, in terms of building a community that is based on, obviously, the traditional importance of the giving of dana, all those traditional things, but also the importance of the education side, which the Mahabodhi Society is dedicated to. So, you know, creating that rounded thing, I think, is really important. And, you know, Buddhism, surprisingly, does, I mean, you know, in comparison to its numerical quantity, actually does surprisingly well. I mean, thinking of Nick sitting there, I mean, Nick used to work for the Tibet Foundation and things, and they were supporting Tibetan refugees. I think, you know, certainly the exile of so many Tibetans has made Buddhism, admittedly Mahayana Buddhism, very visible. So it's surprising how attractive and interested a lot of people are, despite the comparatively small numbers. And probably that is partially due to the fact that it isn't assertive, and it actually develops its sort of poise and dignity because it actually, yeah, because of the way it is. And I think people do actually appreciate that. I mean, I personally, you know, probably all of us here are not very happy. Sometimes we see the statue of the Buddha in completely inappropriate places, and that's, you know, we don't like that. However, having said that, the fact that that particular image at least speaks to certain groups of people who know little about Buddhism as a sense of serenity, I think is really an interesting thing, that it is actually out there. Even though we may not approve of where we might find it, but that sense, it's so that Buddhism does sort of get through. And I think the Buddha image, I mean, those of us who know our history know that Buddhism started for 200 years as aniconic, and it wasn't until Gandhara and the influence of the Greeks. But nonetheless, the Buddha image, I think, is something that is, you know, 100 years ago when this vihara was founded, wouldn't have been, but now is an image that people are aware of and actually imprinted themselves on the minds, not because of assertiveness or because it's calling anyone but actually because of that quiet serenity. So maybe that's, that's one way in which we can build on that. And I know when I I very often do a gallery talk at Chiddingstone. Do come and visit Chiddingstone if you haven't done so already, in Kent, where we have about 200 Buddhist objects, largely, I should say, Northern Buddhism, Tibetan, Chinese, and Japanese as well. But, it's really interesting to see that the image is familiar to people. And actually with a gallery talk, although I can't be the remotest bit Buddhist about it, actually just explaining the images and their meanings, it's amazing just how that chimes with so many people. I must say, I do that about once a month as a gallery talk, and I really enjoy that because it's a way of interacting with people, finding out how much they know already, and actually, on the basis of the objects, being able to explain something about Buddhism and its teachings.
And finally, Graham, I don't think there are any questions.
Excuse me.
In the audience or in the there is a question. Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Just hold on.
Yeah.
We start with the lady at the back.
It's going to be the impossible question just towards the end of the evening, just as I thought it was going well.
If you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Dulmini. I'm actually a Buddhist prison chaplain. So talk about borrowing words from the Christian tradition, hey? Chaplain, yeah. So anyway, yeah, really fascinating talk, and a couple of points that I thought I'd raise and sort of, ask for your view on them. So you mentioned about sort of this idea of etiquette and the sort of proper way of doing things, a sort of decorum to things. And then also you clearly pointed out there were certain dramatic instances when that wasn't the case and when it was, a one-off, let's say. So a couple of thoughts came to me that perhaps it's like a narrative device to sort of heighten the drama of the moment. And, also the idea that those key moments were actually entirely congruent with universal law, therefore they didn't need to be sort of asserted 3 times, maybe that's one point. And then the other idea is so basically as you know, the 10 fetters that need to be broken to gain enlightenment, and the third one is like not relying on meaningless rites and rituals. So I just found it quite beautiful the way that you pointed out this kind of idea of etiquette, and then also it's disrupted, because when is a rite or a ritual meaningful and when is it meaningless? It depends on the context, doesn't it? And I think that's the beauty of Buddhism. There are no commandments. It's a fluid process, and you have to have the wisdom to know what is the most appropriate way to conduct yourself given a particular context or circumstance. So thank you so much for giving us this beautiful talk.
Thank you for that, and thank you for, really interesting. I think you put it so clearly, the idea of there being a single and not a triple request, because it was such a, such a dramatic moment. On rites and rituals, the third fetter, that's something I've thought an enormous amount about and really interested in as to what those were. And it's something I really want to write about at some stage, because it sort of interested me, because sometimes those are seen as an attainment within meditation, to understand that the rites and rituals are not salvific and not ultimately of value, which is going to lead you on the path to awakening. And that's the abandonment. But when you contextualize that, a bit like I did with the Indian teaching, when you contextualize that of someone accepting the Buddha's teachings in a village in ancient India, what will they have done? They will have had to have given up the ancestral ceremonies, particularly keeping the fires and the hearth burning. And therefore, rather than it being a sort of meditative state around you come to the realization that, it might actually be something you've literally got to do, because every day you're involved in those rites and rituals around the Indic hearth, as it were, and therefore need to step back from that. So I think there's a whole interest there, but also I think whole matter of interest. But I think as far as what you could call sort of politeness is concerned, I suppose I don't see that as a rite or a ritual at all. I see that simply about indicating preparedness. And there are various ways of indicating preparedness, which is sitting in the correct place, giving a courteous greeting. That was sometimes enough. People didn't actually need to say anything because they would look prepared and open to teachings. And if you look through the Pāli Canon, I think there are only, I'm going to get this wrong, but let's say 5 instances, and I mentioned most of them, where the Buddha actually speaks to lay people before they ask him a question. And I take that to be pretty, indicative of discerning preparedness.
Can I also just make one last point, is that the kind of the visual aspect, that the visibility of the Buddha's followers was key as well, and as you rightly say, and looking at the contemporary world that we live in today, perhaps that visibility without it being imposed on one. So it's kind of like the Buddhist monastics, as they move through the world, they do it in as gentle a way as possible without imposing their tradition or their views on anyone else, and their visual presence is more a signpost for people to inquire, rather than kind of like getting a megaphone out on Oxford Street or whatever.
No, completely agree. And with respect to the monastics, I would also extend it beyond the monastics, although we're not wearing the robes, actually just in the way that we talk to people, the smile, whatever, that actually becomes something where I think it becomes, as I said, poisonous, is where you're actually thinking, as some people might, if I hand this person a copy of this particular religious book with a particular smile and say, do come to our coffee morning or something, then actually you're creating a relationship for a particular outcome. And for me, that's not really a relationship in the normal sense between two human beings. But I agree with you about the walking lightly.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you could just make it short.
Hello. It was a good comprehensive talk. My question is, I'm trying to imagine how 2,500 years ago the world would have been, obviously, not fully. Even this part of the London would have been a small village and would have been a lot of vacant land, not these flats and houses. So we were able to do that. Now, at that time, because Buddha was a prince and he come from a big royal family, and he gave up all the privileges and became Buddha. And obviously people around him, at least the knowledgeable people, they recognized it. And that evolved into, and then of course, Emperor Ashoka came in, he spread it. I was curious, went to even South India and Sri Lanka at the time also, it came up there. My question is, why these Hindus who converted or who changed into Buddhism reverted back to the same thing, and the Buddhism literally disappeared in that part of the world? Is there any particular?
This is oh heavens, that's an enormously large topic with extraordinarily complex historical. Can I just recommend and I'm only halfway through. There is a brilliant new book on that. I mean, the fact of the Dust on the Throne. Thank you, Dust on the Throne, which is really the story of the decline of Buddhism in India, and then also saying that it actually, in a certain sense, has always been more present there than we might actually have realized, not through, in many cases, the formal ordained Sangha, but actually within Indian thought, and certainly a major revival in the last 200 years. Again, not through what we might call the formal Sangha, but through the revival of Buddhist ideas and Buddhist way of thinking. So it's not quite as blanket, I think, as people might have thought. And the new book, Dust on the Throne, is really such an excellent read about Buddhism in India.
Thank you for that question, Murugesh, and thank you, Graham, for that answer. Sorry, Sebastian, how could we forget? Hold on.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. My Buddhism is at a very elementary level because I wasn't born into a Buddhist family. I'm acquired, I accidentally, shall we say, walked into Buddhism about 12 years ago. So I might know Buddhism at a deep level at some level, some points, but at the same time, my elementary knowledge might be missing. So for that reason, I shall put the following question. The hierarchical system that operates where you're bowing down, etc. Question number one. Is it something that the Buddha, Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, when he was living, he advocated that, and he expected his followers or his Sangha or the monks to do that? And if so, why? And the second thing is Buddhism a religion or a path? I shall stop at that. I do have a lot more, but I'm fully aware that I'm at the last of the queue. Apologies if this was already addressed because I was in the kitchen.
No, so this goes, I think the first of your questions about respect to the monastics, which is what I assume you're talking about. The monastics having the ones who are imparting the teachings to the lay people. I mean, clearly there was an etiquette around that then as now, the sitting on a higher level, the fact that you would have a certain disposition towards the monastics when they were teaching, all of that. And I mean, it might in some ways, it wouldn't have arisen naturally out of contemporary British culture, but actually in ancient India, we can see, and actually still nowadays, I think in Asia, you can see sometimes the relationship of, correct me if I'm wrong, children to parents on specific days at specific times, showing respect to their parents and to their grandparents in a way that could seem perhaps strange to a contemporary British person. So that I think we shouldn't take things out of their cultural context, and the ordained Sangha as the sort of vessels, if you like, of the Buddha's teachings, are obviously in that sense absolutely worthy of respect, and that's how respect has traditionally been offered. I'm not going to answer the question about religion. Why won't I answer the question about religion? Because without getting totally out of my depth, the word in Asian languages, there is no precise analog for the word religion. And it seems to me that the whole question around whether Buddhism is a religion or not was, to use a very English expression, a red herring. A red herring means something completely from outside, thrown into the situation, I'm sorry to say, by missionary activity, to actually say, well, Buddhism's really nice, it's a great idea, but actually it's not actually a religion. What you need is a decent religion. And that was why I really resent the religion question, because actually it does imply, if you're even questioning that, one, it's a category error, and two, you are implying that a religion or a spiritual path should have certain elements, and those elements might, for instance, be a personal creator, and actually saying that because a particular path doesn't have that, therefore it's not a religion. But I specifically won't answer that question, because I think it's a real red herring thrown in by missionary activity to divert people and say, well, it's not a real religion, but what you need is a religion, and we've got one for you. So that's why I don't answer that question. So is Buddhism a religion or a philosophy? You could use the Indian philosophy, both and, either or, whatever, or neither, or simply don't answer the question. I prefer not to answer the question.
To make a comment.
The first issue that came into my mind when I was listening to the question, the discussion you had earlier with Nick, whether it is Sahampati Brahma or Mahabrahma who came and invited the Buddha, that needs to be clarified. One. The second point is important, is not to use particular cultures as prominent, because the Buddha's system, 45 years of preaching, he didn't preach the same thing in the same order, and like certain rules in the Pācitya Pāli, he has changed 6 times, the group eating one. So he has reflected his dynamism of the meaning of why he's making those rules. They are not commandments. And when one transgress, he can go and confess. We use a Christian word. There's nothing wrong in that. Language is a means of communication. We must all be able to use every language and preach Buddhism. Doesn't matter. Not just English culture only. English is my first language. I'm from Singapore. So anyway, the day I ordained, 6 years ago, I gave a sermon. I was only 12 years old. And I could manage now with 10, 12 languages. So language shouldn't be the problem. But ultimate reality is something that you have to follow morally. Basically, for the lay people, 5 precepts, 8 precepts, 10 precepts on particular full moon days. And there are people who do a bit more. There is also a new form of how Buddhism has been reinterpreted in different ways. And there are many controversies, and doesn't mean that the electronic system is the best way as well, because there's a lot of hatred and a lot of gossip and bad things against Buddhism and about Buddhist monks also. So we need to counter those things, not in an aggressive manner, to be in a fairness, following the middle way. Thank you.
I'm happy. Thank you for that really wise intervention.
Can you just wrap up?
Yep.
Just, I could just ask you one question, hopefully. Just very briefly, if you could explain, you've written a book and how you came to write that book and what the book is about. I believe there are some copies here that you'd like to offer to people as well.
Yeah, thank you. So there are some copies which I've left of the book published by a small Buddhist publisher, Mud Pie, and I offer those. So if you'd like to take one and maybe make a donation to the Vihara or something, that's fine, but nothing to do with me if you would like to do that. But no, the book, I mean, I talked about the Buddha image being maybe very familiar to a lot of people, and as I say, also in inappropriate places. And I suppose the book is quite a simple one. It came out, I wrote it during quite a difficult period of serious illness. And the image of the Buddha, which always looks tranquil and always looks very serene. And the interesting thing is that no one who sees that image without knowing anything about Buddhism would realize that the Buddha had all sorts of vicissitudes and, you know, what we could call ups and downs in his life. So, as I say, I think I mentioned the badly behaving monks, the, you know, difficulties with family members, obviously Devadatta assassination attempts, all of those things. It wasn't living at ease at all. And what I tried to do in the book is to gather together for the Buddha as a historical figure based on the Pāli Canon, all those what we could call ups and downs of the Buddha's life, and actually examine how he preserved the famed serenity, which we know about, despite all of that. And I guess that's what the book's about, but it does gather together. I don't think anyone else has done that, actually gather together the sort of ups and downs of what is quite a bumpy life in some ways, but actually one in which he clearly manifested an extraordinary serenity, because if he hadn't have done, you know, his followers wouldn't have been faithful, and we wouldn't have been here today.
I would just like to call upon Venerable Upananda, the visiting monk here at London Buddhist Vihara, to kindly come to the podium and give a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal, for asking me to deliver the vote of thanks. Dr. Dixon, I have always appreciated your perspective on Buddhism. And I have read almost every writings that you have made. Personally speaking, you put me in different directions. And I always appreciate your sympathy, your empathy rather than sympathy with Buddhism. And both as a Buddhist and a humanist, because there are some Buddhists who are not humanist. There are some Buddhists who are humanist, and there are humanists who are not Buddhist. So both as a Buddhist and a humanist, I would like to make a quick comment before I conclude by thanking. So that Buddha rejected Guru culture. However, it has reappeared in predominantly Buddhist societies like Sri Lanka. Now, you know, as we know, the term assertiveness has a negative connotation, but I have come across some Buddhist movements who are not simply assertive, but they are aggressive. To the so much aggressive to the level, so to the extent that some have become even Buddhist evangelists, like in Sri Lanka too. Now, in his Buddha did everything possible to never let his followers to promote him as a guru. Otherwise, he would end up being deified. But he has been deified in different Buddhist traditions. He wanted to remain human. So, in promoting his teachings, followers of certain Buddhist sects over the history have deified him in their effort to promote him. So, whereas Buddha wanted a humanistic reduction, this has been a battle between reduction and promotion. So you put me in different directions. So that being said, you have clearly explained. It's not a fine line. There's a clear line between assertive Buddhism and Buddhism as expected by the Buddha himself. But I don't see a an opposite, the word, proper word for, good word for, as opposed to assertiveness. That being said, thank you so much, Dr. Dixon, for your enlightened presentation today. And on behalf of British Mahabodhi Society, BMBS at London Buddhist Vihara, so I thank you for coming over to share your wonderful insight with us. And we hope to see you again and again here. So we love your, of course, also your voice as well. And then we thank you for your presence here today on behalf of the BMBS. That is especially Amal, Mr. Amal Abewardana, and everyone else. And also on behalf of the London Buddhist Vihara, we thank as a monastic, on behalf of the monks resident here at London Buddhist Vihara, we thank BMBS for organizing this enlightening talk. And we thank each and every one of you for your participation and for asking those wonderful questions. As always, questions put a presenter or a lecturer on different directions. So listening to your questions and comments also. So I learned a lot of different other perspectives on Buddhism. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and enjoy the refreshments. Okay.